Hello, hello, hello. If you are here waiting to hear from our leaders, we're going to start up our event in a couple minutes. Thank you. Da, 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 da. Is that from your event or is that you?
No, it's me.
Hey, that's pretty fire.
New track by Playboy Card. It's super good.
Okay. What's the name?
Meh.
Meh.
Yeah, it just popped up on my list earlier this morning, so I like it.
Are you a Spotify user?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. I used to be an Apple Music person. I was like staunch Apple Music person, and I moved over to Spotify probably like 3 months ago. And the music suggestions are way better.
Yeah.
Way better than Apple Music. It's pretty crazy.
I use and I have used Last.fm for like 14 years, I think. 2006 is when I started. And so I have every song that I've pretty much ever listened to in the last 14 years of my life tracked in there. It's been giving me recommendations for many, many years, but Spotify finally sort of like usurped its quality in giving me recommendations. But it is very good. I was blown away by how good it was.
Last.fm. I thought that Last.fm got sunsetted for some reason. Somebody told, or maybe that was like,
it got bought by CBS at some point many years ago, but it's still, well, actually I haven't logged on for a couple months, but like it's been there. I make sure every time I get a new device that I'm still scrobbling all my stuff. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I couldn't bear to think that like all of this stuff is gone.
One of the things that I think about is like I guess it's not the debt that you build up from using a product that has machine learning. So like it's going to be much harder as I continue to use Spotify to ever move away from it because of how much it knows about me.
Yeah, but it's, they figure it out pretty quick too. So I'm sure if something else comes around.
Then, okay. This was cool. Like you guys didn't have to ask to be on the panel.
Is that cool, or does that mean that someone else can just like randomly?
I think
after getting approved once, we're kind of like pre-approved.
Okay, good. So I'm glad that everyone was paranoid about being able to get on. It makes it easier for
This was way smoother than I expected.
Yeah, if it wasn't for the difficulty of like signing in and having to like go to signing into the conference itself, I would use this over Zoom. For certain things, of course. Okay, I'm gonna just drop a couple notes in the all event to get folks funneled here. So just give me 1 second.
Wow, growth hacking or
Are people going to be chatting sidebar? Is that the idea? Like the attendees?
Yeah. In the session, if any attendees come and say hey to us, which they will, I promise. then I assume that they're going to have they're going to be asking questions in the sidebar. And there's a recruiter named Jess who might be here, who is going to be managing any like typical questions that come up. And if any like really interesting one comes up that you just want to address, like totally jump in and do that. Okay, we got a couple folks here. Hey, thank you for joining us, whomever you are. Actually, it would be great if you could introduce yourself, and maybe where you're tuning in from Nextplay, or into Nextplay from. Crickets. Okay, all good.
I see like a and session.
Yeah.
On the chat. I guess which one is which?
So the event one, from what I could tell, is everyone who's in the event. Like it's a group messaging from everyone.
So like the whole, all the attendees can see that.
Yes, exactly.
Got it.
Come and hang. It's kind of funny. There are a couple of people who are sharing the attendee list. I know you're not supposed to do that.
Oh.
So I think they think they're private messages.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Come and hang out. Hang out.
I'm gonna test something.
Okay. Rich hit me. Okay, we have a couple people. So let's just kick it off. I will introduce people as it goes. I feel like people are going to be in and out either way. We have a couple of folks who are Airtablets in the session. Hey, Shawnee, thank you for being here. Hey, Jess, thank you for being here. I don't know who the lone person who is not an Airtablet at the moment is in here, but you know what? We're just going to get started. Hey, how are you all doing today?
Good.
Good. Really excited to be here at Nextplay events, where Airtable, essentially our mission is to democratize software creation. We build something that at first glance looks like a spreadsheet, but is way more powerful than that. And you'll find out why during this session. And you'll find out why during our booth that opens at 6:00, where we'll have more folks who can answer questions for you. My name is Al Bray. I run diversity and inclusion at Airtable. I've been working there for about a year, and we have 3 of our incredible engineering leaders here to talk to you about the unwritten rules of work. So we have Jimmy Hillis, who's head of core product, Richard Sin, who's engineering manager of platform ecosystem, and then we have Megan Anktil, senior site reliability engineer and engineering manager. In terms of unwritten rules of work, the first thing that we're going to do is just have you all go around and say your name, your role, and just give a couple of sentences on what you do at Airtable. So let's start with Jimmy, go to Megan, and then end out with Richard.
Hey, I'm Jimmy. Yeah, I've been at Airtable for about a year now too. I am the head of the core product group at Airtable. We are responsible for all of our sort of like existing users in the product and making sure that they have the tools and the Lego kit, if you will, to sort of build their applications and support their business workflows. And so we support building all your schemas and your views, as well as other collaboration features and permissions and that sort of thing. I'll hand it over to Rich.
I guess I'll say hi. Hi, I'm Richard. I'm an engineering manager here on Platform Ecosystem. I support the team that's in charge of helping build out extensions effectively to the Airtable product, basically supporting external developers to build more things on top of Airtable. That includes things like the API. We also have this feature called blocks, which are like apps that run on top of Airtable. So that's a platform for developers to build additional things on top of Airtable. I've been here for almost 2 years now. Been working on the platform team.
Awesome. Megan, you're up.
Cool. My name is Megan. I think I'm the newest. I've been at Airtable coming up on 3 months now. currently managing our production engineering team, and we're responsible essentially for two things. I'd say site reliability is the biggest one. You know, we keep the lights on. Something's not working. We're probably working under the hood to make sure it gets working as fast as it can. And then also there's an element of sort of developer productivity that our team works on, which is trying to enable the rest of engineering so that they can do their job efficiently and quickly.
Nice. Well, thank you all for sharing what you do. Hopefully it gave the folks who are here a little bit of a sense of what we're working on at Airtable and some of the interesting problems we have. So, as we were kind of going over these questions and thinking about unwritten rules, I think one of the things that we all agreed with, we want to leave folks with some like really actionable and practical things, tactics that they could use to develop in their career. So we have some specific questions that we've already thought about, y'all. But if you have questions that you would like us to answer ad hoc, please let us know and put them in the chat so that we can make sure that we're answering the questions that you have. But the first one that I have for all of you is that before Airtable, Airtable is a startup. We're at 270 people right now. And a lot of the folks in the audience, or a lot of folks who are coming to Nextplay are at bigger companies. So you were at bigger companies before you came to Airtable. Can you talk about the things that or the advice that you would give folks who are at big companies now and are thinking about how it might be different at a startup? So let's start with Rich, go to Megan, and then end with Jim.
I think one thing was at the bigger companies or more mature companies, there's like playbooks in place for a lot of things that you do, right? There's processes and playbooks. Even if you might not even think about it, because if you're there for a long time, it's almost like second nature to do those things in that way. And a lot of those playbooks and processes evolved throughout the years while that company was growing and becoming what it was today. I was, before Airtable, I was at Twitter, and a lot of those processes were mature. A lot of the engineering processes and even our tooling was very mature. At smaller companies, that stuff is in the process of happening sometimes, and sometimes not even there. So I think getting used to that. And the exciting part is, you're part of defining and building out those things. And it's experimental. I think like just because we say we're going to build out a playbook doesn't mean that your first version of that is going to be correct. As a company grows and as your startup grows, we're at 270 people. There was a time when Airtable was 20 people. The playbooks and processes for that are very different from then till now. But long story short, yeah, I think like at a bigger company, a lot of these things are very mature. They're very well thought out, well written, well done. Doesn't necessarily exist in a smaller company, and you're there to kind of build that out, help build that up.
Nice. What about you, Megan? What things have you learned since transitioning from a bigger company like Slack, who I think that you're with an even smaller to a company like Airtable?
Yeah, I think what Richard was saying about sort of making sure you take some initiative because there's a lot of things that aren't really built in for you yet is probably the biggest one. Before this, I was at Slack when Slack was a small company, up through when it was a big company. Before that, I was at an even smaller company. And I think the big difference is kind of that how many processes are already in place, how many things have already been kind of like decided for you, and how much are you kind of like slotting into a clear existing need versus how much is it, maybe it's a bit more nebulous, but for me, the reason I decided to go back to a small company is that like being able to define direction and help grow things out from the really small phase is super exciting. But it does require kind of being comfortable taking a bit of a leap of faith, or being comfortable putting yourself out there to say like, yeah, I have this idea, I have this suggestion, this seems like a good direction for the company or the team or whatever you're working on to go in. And just kind of having some confidence to share those ideas and kind of try to push them forward.
Awesome. Jim, last but not least.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to that, and I'll take a slightly different version of this, which is just around like, what you're building and sort of like the product angle. I think like, one of the big differences at a big company to a small company is that in a big company, you have a lot of support and a lot of like foundational knowledge. There's people that just like, they understand what they're building, they understand their users, they understand the context by which like all of this stuff has been developed in the past. And at a smaller company, in a younger company, it just doesn't really exist, right? That stuff takes time and people to sort of like generate. And so, sort of coming into a smaller company, like it's really important that like you really understand, your customers, your product, the things that you're trying to build, and like basically the problems that you're trying to solve, because internalizing it is like the best way to be successful. You can't really rely on other people to be the owner of that knowledge. Coming into Airtable, this was sort of one of the things that I was excited by, and like even in that first sort of a couple months, one of the things was like, oh, like we need to go and like build for customer X. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, what's customer X? And they're like, oh, we don't know. It's just like a word. Like, we just call them creators. Go like, go solve for them. And like immediately I was like, oh, okay. So, in that, it's like, go figure out what that means. Go and ask people, go and learn it. You really have to sort of like own the sort of space that you're working in, and sort of be comfortable that, nobody is really building up that. There's nobody that has all the answers. I think that's one of the most exciting parts of coming to a startup, is that like you don't have the answers. Your job is to go and figure them out, to sort of develop them and like build that foundational knowledge. So it's a big difference, I think, from any sizable company.
Yeah, and so what I'm kind of hearing is that like at the end of the day, you're leaving processes and things that and support for for ideas that kind of like not already exist, for going kind of building, we call it building the plane while flying it at the end of the day. So how can folks kind of like, there's a confidence shift in owning something and also being okay with it not exactly hitting the mark at the end of the development cycle. So how do you all kind of manage that change in mindset, from like being supported by processes and people around that can kind of stop you from making a mistake, to actually be thrown into a situation where it's okay to make mistakes, and you're really like, the job is really to learn from those. Does that question make sense?
Yeah.
Let's maybe go opposite. So Megan, Jimmy, Rich.
Cool. Yeah, I was going to say, I think part of it is, while you maybe don't have the supportive processes, you can still have the supportive people. And I think that one of the biggest things is like having a supportive manager and having a supportive organization who like gives you the power to make mistakes, or gives you the power to kind of have those ideas and push them forward. And it's sort of a thing where you have to like work together. You don't want to like go in and just bowl everyone over with like, here's my ideas, they're the right thing, I'm going to push them through. Like, you want to have conversations with people along the way about like, hey, how do you feel about this? And I found that in a good supportive environment, like those are good two-way conversations, such that you're like, yeah, this probably is a good idea, and I'm going to adapt it based off of this person's feedback. But it's clear that the idea is the thing that's trying to get pushed forward.
Yeah. Plus one to that, and like adding on to that, I think there is like, at smaller companies, especially early on, everyone's in the same boat as you, right? Like you don't have this sort of big mixture necessarily of people who sort of like have all the answers, and then some who are just like new to it. And so because you're all in it together, like it's generally a much more supportive environment in that way, because there's like, hey, like it's really easy to sort of like divide and conquer, because hey, none of us know what we're doing. Let's go and like figure this out. There's a lot of like camaraderie with that. And I think like, even broadening past that, for me, like one of the things that I think is really important, and I use this sort of like metaphor a lot of the times, like it's not about, in a startup, making sure that you're on the most like efficient route, right? Like if you already knew what that was, if like anyone starting a company could determine that beforehand, like we would all be in like extremely successful companies from day one, right? Like it's a very fuzzy path. And so trying to understand like directionally where you need to go, like understanding that like, is it left or right? Like as long as you know that, and as long as you're going in the right direction, it doesn't really matter if you take, the path least traveled, or you sort of like swerving all over the place. It's really just about make sure you have your bearings, understand the sort of like direction you want to go in, and just make sure you're pushing in that way, because progress at the end of the day is the most important thing. And you'll learn, and the path will become narrower and more clear as you sort of build up your awareness and your success. And so it's really just like making sure at the high level, left from right. And that's usually enough to make good progress.
Awesome. I love the progress at the end of the day is the most important thing, because I feel like you can get wrapped up in the actual result. Rich, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's it called? I just have to plus one everything everybody said. I guess the only thing I add on to that is like, it's not about building process is a dirty word, right? Like it's not about building process for the sake of process. But what it is if you think about how at your last company that process came to be, there was a reason for it. Something happened, maybe an incident happened that needed to build out something for that, right? And where we are here with our company is like, in some sense, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that is really helpful when you have the trust of the people, like what Megan was saying too. Yeah, I think that's the only additional thing I'd add, I guess. So I think, yeah, the fact that we're all in it together is definitely a big thing, like Jimmy was saying. And being comfortable with comfortable is that's much easier to do when you have the trust of your folks.
That's true. That's true. And I think, this kind of dovetails nicely into the next kind of a fun question, which is like working in a startup does bring a lot of failure, right? So can you describe a time in which you've just like totally failed spectacularly, whether it's at Airtable or somewhere else? And what lesson did you learn from that failure? And Rich, I'm going to pick on you because you said that you had a ton of these stories. So I assume that you have some ammo to share with us.
Oh.
How about we start with you?
Yeah, sure thing. I think I want to make two statements before I actually even answer that question. One is I think my career has been effectively defined by failure, honestly. And number two, though, I also recognize I'm in a very privileged situation to be able to fail and still move forward, if that makes sense. I think like that's not true for every demographic, actually. Like some people don't get the benefit of the doubt when they fail. And I think I've been in that, I'm privileged to be such that like when I fail, I get the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes I get the second chance. And I think that's like a very important thing to recognize, both like for the companies that you're at, societally. So I just want to call that out. Man, yeah. And honestly, it's at like every level of abstraction, from I made failures in career choices to like in my day-to-day work, I have accidentally overwrote in the production database everybody's access token with my access token. To like even like my first I'd say like, but the one I'll talk about is this one actually, and I think I was lucky to experience this. Was I was doing a master's program, and it was effectively like a job, and I didn't know anything about communication, getting buy-in, being on the same page, and I had two advisors. And one advisor I had a great rapport with, the other one, not as much. And when it came time to getting my thesis signed, like my one advisor that I had a great rapport with, he signed it off, said, yeah, this is great. No worries from my end. And then I was just never on the same page with my other advisor. And I think that was just like a very good lesson for me to luckily experience before I was actually jumping into the industry. To have failed in that way, learn those lessons, I think was a real big blessing. And it was just about like learning to communicate, learning to, give people a heads up when things aren't going well, which I think I did. I would shy away with the person who had I would talk about it with the person who had a better relationship because it's just easier to talk about those things than shy away and never just, 3 weeks. I should have let him know that things weren't going well 2 months ago, but then I let him know, hey, by the way, this isn't going well. Just surprising news to the other person, right? And I think those kinds of lessons were super valuable for me. So yeah, just like being able to stumble like that and being able to reflect on why things aren't going so well, I think has been super helpful for me. And then I think, my entire career, like I said, every step of the way, at every level of abstraction, I think I've made mistakes. But I think being privileged to be able to make those mistakes, and then also at the same time, I think on my end too, being able to reflect on it and see how I could have maybe done better. What are some lessons learned moving forward? Man, that's sort of a rambling answer, but yeah.
Oh, you're muted, Aubrey. No, we can't hear you anymore.
Yeah.
You're going to come back in. Okay.
I can.
You want to go? Just answer. Yeah, go ahead.
I can share some of mine. Yeah, I mean, I have plenty of specific examples. I pulled down server after server in my life accidentally, but I actually, I think sort of, actually just riffing off, some of the stuff that Richard was talking about. I think for me, one of my sort of like early failures, failure modes, I would say is actually probably more accurate, was sort of like belief that like being like academically correct was like always the way to solve a problem, right? If you're like, 1+1=2, it means that like no matter what you do, that like that's the only thing that matters, right? If you can, have a product spec which is like, I want to build this thing, and you can like show mathematical proof that like this is the thing to build, that like that would be enough. And the truth is that it isn't enough. And there's good reasons for it. Like there are humans associated with all of these decisions, both the people that you're building for, both the people that you're trying to convince, both the people that you need to sort of like motivate or convince to do the work that you're doing. And I think that that sort of like over reliance on trying to prove things, on like being right, was a really bad failure mode for me, and something that I see honestly in a lot of sort of people coming up through tech, right? Like in general, we're all like super smart. We come from that sort of STEM background where like, a lot of it's math based, right? You can't, like, you are right or wrong, so to speak. And so you try to reapply that into these sort of areas that aren't that just have too much nuance, right? You have things like strategy, which doesn't have a right answer or a wrong answer until 10 years later, and then it doesn't matter another 10 years after that because everything has to change. And so I think for me, really understanding the people that I was talking to, their sort of like needs, their sort of like fears, the sort of things that like excited them, was like really important, because you could still have the right idea, but it's how you message it, it's how you communicate, it's how you bring people along. I think a lot of people talk about this in terms of like politics, and it gets this like really dirty sort of like reaction. But I don't think it's true, right? Like it's just a sort of reflection and an acknowledgement that like there are people associated with all of these things, and that you have to engage with them. You have to meet them about halfway. You have to be empathetic to them. And I think that's something that I've learned slowly. I would say it's something that like I don't think I'm perfect at by any means at this point, but it's something that I reflect on in any discussion I have. If you go to someone with an idea and they just like it just bounces right off them, or they have a sort of like a critical or negative reaction to it, it's like, okay, hold on, like why did they feel that way? It's not that like they don't understand necessarily. It's that like there's something in the way that we discussed it that just like didn't land effectively. And so that's something for me that I think is like a really big sort of failure mode that I've seen in my past.
Quick, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Megan, it's up to you.
Cool. Yeah, I think I have an interesting one. I feel like it's going to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but like to Richard's point earlier about privilege, I've like most of my failures have been on like technical side from doing like operational things. And like even those came after like I'm a Black woman in tech. If I fuck up, it's not that it's like, oh, she had a problem. It's like all Black women in tech are now incompetent. And so there's like an added weight thing because it just kind of persisted through my whole career of just like, I like triple or quadruple check everything. I like trust things to the extreme. And I just like, I remember one time I took the site down when I was at Slack, and it was like after I had already done like thorough testing, and I had like tested it, and I had like gotten multiple eyes, and it was like, here's this thing. And it's, I think the failure mode there is like learning like there will be things that are outside of your control that are going to go wrong, whether they're technical or just like you might be working on a project and something happens with someone else on the project due to like circumstances outside of your control. It's kind of learning that there's a limit to the things that you have control over, and like learning to roll with the punches, and learning to understand how to like where there are areas for you to improve, and understand like failure in itself is like not the problem. The problem that I think comes with failure is if you fail and you don't learn anything from it. And so for me, I think that's been like probably the biggest thing, is just making sure that like if something goes wrong, how can I like move forward on it? And then, but also like it's interesting to like, again, ripping off of Richard's thing on privilege, it's like figuring out like, do I need to do some sort of damage control? And I've been fortunate thus far that like that's not been the case for because I've really had failures, but it's a thing that I am aware of, and I think it's a thing that for some folks like you just kind of have to be aware of at all times.
Yeah. I'm going to deviate real quick because there was a question in the chat. And actually, Megan, I think this would be a good one for you. And then for anyone who is currently hiring and thinking about how they're thinking about non-traditional students or non-traditional folks. So assuming you don't have a CS degree, what kinds of projects do you feel set a non-traditional candidate apart? What gives you confidence in their ability to be technically competent? So if you want to take a couple seconds to think about it, and then whenever um, jump in whenever you come up with an answer.
Yeah, I think I can speak some to this just because it's similar to one of the questions we kind of talked about earlier. So for context for folks listening, I come from a non-traditional CS background. I did a humanities degree. I'm totally a fuzzy. I did do like tech support to help pay the bills when I was in college, but like I did not take engineering classes. I made it all the way up through vector calculus, and then I was like, never again. Don't want to touch it. I did like later find out that like computer science was all about like logic and fun, and I was like, oh, opportunities. But to your question, I think that it kind of depends on your circumstances. So I'll sum out where I was already working in a technical company, and then speak to what I've seen for people who are looking for a job who aren't currently working somewhere. So for me, it came honestly through talking with connections, having friends in engineering, expressing interest. I was self-taught in the days before we had all the boot camps. So that was like a lot of late nights of going on MIT OpenCourseWare and Stanford and just like watching lectures and doing things and sort of teaching myself the fundamentals while also talking to people in the company to ask like, what sort of startup projects do you think I could help chin on? Like, give me like tiny bite-sized things. And I had one friend who she really stepped up and kind of started feeding me those projects. And then I just went to the CTO at the time and was like, hey, this is something I'm serious about. Like, what are the things you would need to see for me? And so if you're already in a company, I think talking to CTO or a manager or director in engineering and asking like what they're looking for and seeing if there's a way that you can kind of start feeding into that process is really helpful. I'd say if you're not at a tech company yet, I think the biggest thing is kind of showing projects, especially through like open source contributions to big projects that are kind of like either something like some technology that the companies you're interested in are using or that you have like a deep interest in, because it shows like, one, you're already interested in contributing to the community. Two, you kind of like, if you have things that are getting accepted and pushed upstream, like you're solid, you're on top of it. It's just sort of like any sort of like demonstrated track record. But I think that like open source in particular is a nice one just because it's like anyone can go in and give it a try. You don't have to have a traditional background. You just have to kind of have the skills, and you can acquire those in a variety of ways.
Awesome.
I'd like to add to that too. Like I think like one other version of this, I think a lot of the times, people focus on the technical side, which I think is great, right? Like, there are sort of these skills that you need or are expected to have at least to come in and be able to like, execute and do good work. But another version of this too that I think is really important, especially for folks who are, maybe a little bit more entrepreneurial or sort of like product focused, is just like go build things, right? Like I think there's a lot to be said around sort of like finding problems that you can solve by yourself and or with some friends or whatever it is, just get together, hang out, and like actually just build and solve things. Like there's actually a lot of sort of proof in this sort of thing. Like, hey, whatever, I saw this problem, in my friend group or my community or online, whatever it is, and you just go and solve for that, right? Like those skills, those a term that we're using right now in the office is like secret finders. That skill, you can't teach it. You can't learn it necessarily, right? You get it from like practice, from like asking questions, from like, making intuitive leaps and then starting to build and go, oh man, that's wrong. And then going rebuild and like, oh, okay, this is a bit better. And so just like, the work that we do can be done, outside of the company. And I think it's a really good experience. It's something that like, honestly, you're not going to get in general from any college or any boot camp necessarily, right? Like they really focus on the technical skills, which are like one part of this. But yeah, highly recommend solving problems that you kind of see in the wild and really honing those
If I could add two more things, I think I really recommend the open source approach, but I also recognize that like open source community can be innovating as well. But if you can just start small, like even if you're not contributing to it, just like seeing what's out there, starting to read the code. So can you make sense of the code, and then seeing ways to kind of just contribute small step by steps, and then start building it up. It's like building up that capital little by little. And the second thing I'll say is finding a coach somehow. And I think this is key because I think finding a great coach is super important to be able to make sure that you're practicing correctly. But here's where it's interesting. A coach doesn't necessarily have to be a person per se, one thing. That coach can be a book. That coach can be a course. That coach can be that open source project community that you're trying to contribute to and the feedback that people are providing. But I think like trying to build up those coaches in your lives to help contribute and build those projects, even if you're trying to, whether even you're starting a company or contributing to open source. I think that's the only other thing I'd add to it. But yeah.
Totally. So to just summarize, it sounds like being part of it are like the technical skills, but also like engineering, especially getting into tech, is about curiosity and getting out there and showing your curiosity publicly through things like open source and open source and like building your portfolio as much as you can. And then lastly, to Rich's point, making sure that you get someone or something that can help you along the way. Yeah. And I definitely feel that. Like I went to a coding boot camp and I was a software engineer for a year at JP Morgan. And part of it was, even during my interview, part of what they were saying was like, my tech skills were part of why I ended up getting hired, but it was really my problem solving ability. And those two things are the same, but not the same, but similar, and have different things, it's a similar skill set that you're just applying to tech in general. So yeah, great question, Nicole. And if anyone else has a question, let us know. Or if you bring back the cat, I see in the chat. And one thing that I want to think is a kind of a good extension of this is going from being an individual contributor to a manager. So I assume it takes a similar mindset to move from IC to managing people and leading people. So what are some of the different the biggest changes that you have felt from and moving from being an individual contributor to a manager, or what are the different things you have to focus on now that folks should prepare themselves to maybe make that move? Megan, Jimmy, Richard?
Yeah. I think there's a number of things. I think, so for me, I'm a very strong believer of the fact that management is a different track from IC work. And I think that is something that definitely varies by company, and sometimes even within a company. But for me, that's how I approached it. And when I made that transition at Slack, that's how we approached it there. I think one of the biggest things is kind of the shift away from where you get your sense of like satisfaction and accomplishment. As an IC, you have a lot of direct involvement with the tech. You're shipping things, you're writing code, and you're super involved with the projects. And as a manager, you're doing a lot more enablement. And so it can sometimes feel hard to, like, you don't really have that same sense of ownership. Like good management, if your team ships the product, you're like, my team did great. You don't say I did that. Like it's very much like in service of other people. But what that means is that like you're not getting that like daily dopamine hit of like, push code, it's pass tests, great. It's like it's a very different feeling. So for me, it came through a mix of kind of learning to better do like long-term time management, and understanding like what accomplishments were going to make me feel fulfilled, whether that was through growing folks' careers or, surfacing the projects and things that they were working on. It's definitely just a very different job. The time management aspect is a pretty big feature of it, I'd say.
Yeah, that I'll plus one. That feedback loop, that sort of like realization of your work is so drastically different in a manager. I mean, I think, I've seen quite a few people sort of like make that transition and sort of like, report to me. And I obviously have the same thing when I went through it. But like that first thing I tell everyone is like, you're just going to have to like be okay with this loop being a lot longer. It takes months, if not longer, a lot of the times to see your kind of work come across. So I totally feel that. I think for me, the one, my favorite one of this is that, when I became a manager, immediately, one of the biggest things I had to learn was that I couldn't, in fact, tell people what to do. It was super counterintuitive, I think, at the time, because it's they're your boss, right? "Quote unquote" boss. And so I just tell a bunch of people to go write this and do that. And hey, it's going to be great. If I could only do 10 times as much, that's what I need. And, the truth is the minute you have that sort of explicit authority is exactly the time that you need to stop using it, right? Because it's just a really powerful tool that can have really negative effects, right? Your job as a manager isn't to make sure that everyone is doing what you want them to do. It's to make sure that they're able to do their best work and make decisions on their own. And so you really have to shift that to sort of how do I tell them what to do, to how do I give them the context and the coaching and the experience and whatever it is to make the decision that either I think they should make or that I would like them to make, or better yet, the right decision for the moment that might in fact be a better decision than I could even come to. And that change of thought is really difficult at first and sort of really challenging. But the truth is just to take a step back from it, it's for all the things that you can tell them to do, they're going to be making 99.9% of their decisions without you there. And so it's just extremely impractical. It's extremely sort of disempowering to folks to just be go do A. And in fact, just be hey, here's the problems, here's what I'm thinking, here's the strategy, and then sort of help them, make those intuitive leaps. I think that for me, that was, one of the biggest changes in sort of how I communicate and how I get stuff done as a manager versus being an IC where, yeah, you do, you get problem, you do solution, you go do work.
Yeah.
Before we get on to that subject, I'd love to, and I know I'm being asked, so let me know if it's hard to hear me, but how do you start working on building influence without authority before you become a manager? Because it sounds as you said, once you become a manager, authority is probably the last thing that you want to flex. So how can folks kind of build their influence muscle to prepare themselves to take a leadership position? And of course, I want to hear from you, Jamie, but I think it's an interesting question for all of you.
Yeah, I think if I'll quickly jump in, I think leadership can come from anywhere. And oftentimes, actually, I think in companies, you have your management chain, but you also have your leadership chain, which is not necessarily by direct report. So, some people in the company who might not be an actual manager or have reports actually have outsized influence for what they are for what they're doing. And I think that comes with you have to build up that capital. You have to first of all build up your own capital in the company, or whatever team or organization that you're in. You have to build up that trust. You have to build up your influence in that way. And it comes with not just I think Megan said earlier too, bulldozing your ideas through, but constantly, time and time, repeatedly showing that, oh yeah, I'm able to drive these decisions in a way that is successful for the team, successful for the company, successful for the product, whatever you're working on. And I think that's how you build up that leadership influence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And it's really being able to sort of, I think I talked about this a little bit too, navigating the people around you and their needs and their wants and their sort of ideas. I think, real leaders don't necessarily require authority because, all they're doing is really taking everything that they kind of hear around them, mixed up with their own ideas and things that they understand, and really just charting a path that everyone can follow and be a part of, right? And it doesn't have to be your idea. I think some of the most successful leaders by far are those who listen really well to those around you and take the best pieces of everything, join them together and sort of just repackage, or, oh yeah, we should do this and we should take some of that and kind of go forward. And so I think a lot of it is just, building these connections, being okay and being able to sort of synthesize lots of different ideas and pulling them together, not being so convince. I think even when we talk about sort of like influencing without authority, it's not about being right. It's about convincing people that this is the thing to do. It doesn't matter if your idea. In fact, like a lot of the times, like if you get too stuck in your own ideas, like that's actually where you're going to be least successful, because you're not able to sort of pull in from all these like diverse ideas and thoughts and things around you. And it's really somebody who can acknowledge those around them, other ideas, and kind of bring them together collaboratively in most cases, and sort of like present them, effectively, and keep presenting them, keep doing that work, keep talking to people. Your ideas are always valuable. It doesn't, nobody's taught to have good ideas. You learn them based off of all sorts of things in your sort of like path there. And so speak up, talk about things, have that conversation multiple times. Don't hold it in. Don't wait until it's perfect. Just start getting out there and speaking the things that you think are important that you've heard.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with all of that. I think it comes down to trust. Like influence essentially comes through, and like Richard was saying, like you can have leadership at management level, but also very much in IC levels. And I think you have to kind of work together with leaders on your team to make sure that they're able to do the things that need to get done. Yeah, I think it's about building trust and making sure that people feel heard and they understand why you're trying to push things in the direction that you're trying to push them in. And not that it's just a like, you never want to be in a like because I said so situation. Like that's like you have failed. Like you haven't done the job of making sure people understand like what the goal is, that they are bought into what that goal is, that they feel enabled to like move towards that goal. So it's about just like building that trust in whatever way you can on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And like a lot of my roles influence without authority. It's the best in the sense that it's really just about understanding what everybody wants to bring to the table, tying it up in a bow, and then trying to get that to go the same direction, which is awesome. So I'm glad to hear that you all think about your leadership styles as that, because you're right. Authority is not the thing, especially in a startup environment, that gets things done quickly and efficiently. So the next question I have is about the Airtable or interviewing. So we're totally shifting gears here to kind of things on the more of the recruiting side and the Airtable side. Airtable is known for having a very, very tough interview in general, and you all have gone through it at various. Hopefully, everyone went through it. So for this is actually a really big thing on Glassdoor. People talk about how difficult our interview is, et cetera, et cetera. What's one thing what's one piece of advice you would want to give to yourself pre-Airtable about the interview, to how to prepare for it, or even how to think about let's go Rich, Megan, Tippett.
Actually, I didn't go through the traditional interview process. I joined as a contractor first, and then I had a slightly different path here at Airtable. But I also understand, though, about interviewing is tough. I think I also want to make a preamble statement that the state of the technical interview is broken, in my opinion. And but given that we are in the world we are in, at Airtable, we do try our best to make sure that it is as fair as possible. That being said, there's still work to be done for sure. But and advice I give for myself in general is interviewing is tough. Like, don't lose hope. It's a numbers game in some sense, and trying to take each way to learn from your experiences. And in a similar vein, I think it's like trying to find a coach, right? Figuring out how to, not just for Airtable, but any kind of interview situation you get into, finding a coach to help you prepare. And like I said, it doesn't have to be necessarily a person, right? But it's a way to make sure that you're moving in a progressive direction. You're constantly improving. You're not just maybe doing the same thing over and over, but something to push you, make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, because I think that's how you grow. And finding that coach that can help you do that, whether it's a book, whether it's a course, whether it is a person. I guess that's what I say.
Yeah, I think the advice also kind of probably varies some because I interviewed as a manager, which is going to be different from the technical interview. And I think to Richard's point, I agree. I think in general, the technical interviews across the industry are like one of the strangest things that we should just be trying to fix as a whole. But I think it comes down to just like have an idea of what the like what style of interview you'll be dealing with. Understand like what fundamentals you need to know versus how much you need to understand like general architecture. Those things are going to vary also based on like seniority. The sort of newer engineers we expect to be fairly strong on fundamentals. I think that's fairly universal in most places. And the longer you've been in the industry, the more we're going to expect you to have some experience with things of larger scope and scale. I think the other thing that I think is just general good interview advice wherever you go is I think you should always make sure you come prepared with a good set of questions to ask your interviewers. I think a thing that people often forget is that like interviews are two directional. It shouldn't or bidirectional. It shouldn't be a like they're just grilling you and then at the end you have like one or two small questions. Like you should be doing your due diligence to figure out like, do these people have the values I care about? Is this team a team that I'm really excited to work with? Are there opportunities here? Like there's a lot of things that you should take some time and kind of figure out what things you value in a place we're going to be working for, and then make sure you have some questions to kind of sort that out.
Agreed. I might go a little bit more practical for ours, and I actually think one of the things we do differently at Airtable than a lot of the sort of like larger companies that we actually do a lot of design interviews. We don't do any whiteboard coding. You can use a whiteboard or Miro or some such at the moment, but a lot of our questions on the technical side are really sort of like problems, right? Like, how do we solve this product problem? And there's a lot of technical stuff into that, or, how do we do this? And so, one really big piece of advice that I would give for our interviews, and this is actually applicable to all other interviews, is like, understand the question and ask a lot of like follow-up questions. One of the like biggest, I think, sort of like failure modes that we see often is people who jump straight to a solution, who sort of like, oh, I got it, and then they go. And then all of a sudden they're like halfway and they like didn't actually get it. And now instead of like solving the question that we actually had them, they're actually stuck trying to undo what they're doing without actually undoing it because they're trying to be like, oh, no, like I got this. And so you're like then stuck in this mode where you kind of can't back out, or it's more difficult to. So understand the question. In fact, like for what it's worth, like most of our questions and others, like they don't actually have a like singular answer. What we want to know is like, what part of it are you solving? How are you going to solve that part? And so if you can talk, collaborate, like our interviewers love to talk, like they've seen, like it's very rare that they will see an answer, a new answer, or sort of be confused by a path. Like they're likely to have engaged with this before. Ask them questions like, oh, did you want me to solve for this? Like, is this important? How are we thinking about this? And then sort of like start to build it out. I talk about this in terms of like altitude a lot. Like what altitude are you solving the problem in or communicating in? And always start at that really high altitude. Like, what are the problems that we care about right now? What are the problems we should be solving? And then you lower down. Like you only write code or solve at the deepest level, but that's just like one part of it. So yeah, ask questions, collaborate. Don't feel like we're just like judging everything that you do. We're actually trying to like help you work through the problem. Because what we want to know is like, if I'm going to sit next to you for 8 hours a day or on Zoom, and we're going to work together, like, can we actually do that? Like, can you show me you have problem solving skills and the rest of it? So that would be my advice for the honestly, not just our technical ones, but definitely a lot.
Actually, I want to quickly plus one that I think like getting on the same page and clarifying and collaborating with the interviewer is a very big part of it, I think. And that will help you move forward with the problem.
About that a little bit, like how do you build the rapport, or how do you think about building rapport, and then kind of leaning on, because I know when I was first technically interviewing years and years and years ago, it felt like the more questions I asked, the were like negative dings against my my interview. So like, how do you think about, as someone who hires, questions, how they're formed, and how someone builds a relationship with you over the cycle of the interview itself?
I think if I can jump in there, like my personal take is that folks should always be asking clarifying questions. And as an interviewer, when I was doing technical interviewers and interviewing other people, like people asking questions, that's great. And that's like how you build that collaboration. Is in the same way, if I'm going to be working on a project with someone, I don't want to be like, here's like the problem. They're like, cool, see you later. And they just like run off to go build it. Like, I expect them to have a back and forth with me about like, oh, like, what did you mean by this? Or like, what is this constraint? Or my assumption is it works this way, but like, can you, like, is that actually how that works? Like, those are real world conversations that you have. And like, I think the fastest way to build that collaboration is by like trying to engage in that conversation. And I think going back to my point before about like having questions for the interviewers, I think that that dynamic is like another way to kind of understand, like, is this a place I want to work for? Is it a place where they're like expecting you to just like go straight through and there's not going to be any sort of collaboration or clarification, and they're just like looking for a single like, here's the whiteboard algorithm thing and we're not going to have any discussion about it? Or are they like willing to talk with you about like, oh yeah, that's a good question and here's how I would approach it? Like, it's another one of those things where always think about that bidirectionality of the interview, like build that rapport, have a conversation, see if they're responsive to that, and then
there's actually a question in the chat which is kind of tied into this, which I think is actually ties into a lot of this, like, you know, in terms of like interviewee people giving the interview, feeling like they wish they were somewhere else. And like, you know, the truth is like that's not an uncommon thing, I think, for a lot of, you know, folks, especially like high growing companies. Like, they're asked to do a lot of interviews, and you know, just pragmatically, you know, they ask the same question, you know, over and over again. And so like when it's the 100th time somebody has to answer the same technical question, it is a little bit harder to be engaged with just the problem. If you like walk in and you're just like, oh cool, like I'll just write some system calls, and like you don't interact with them, you don't engage with them, it is, you know, it's harder for them to then also be engaged with you, right? They don't know you, they're not getting sort of like any of that rapport. And so, you know, I do think this is like a little bit of a problem that, you know, companies need to do better. It's not even training, right? These folks generally know how to do the interview. It's like, how do you get motivated and engaged by it? And that's something that companies need to get better at, and understand that like, if you engage well in the recruiting side, you actually make your life better. If you engage badly, you actually make your life worse. But you can also do a lot to just, you know, engage with them, right? Talk to them, you know, collaborate with them. It definitely comes off. Like, you know, when somebody's come in and built up that engagement, who's talks, who asks questions, who kind of engages, it's always going to come out in the write-up. Like, very often we want to see like, you know, how was their communication? How were they sort of engaging? It's not about like, could they speak properly, or did they, you know, it's just like, did they engage, right? Did they talk through their thoughts? Did they tell me what they're thinking? Did they go like, I'm stuck here, I don't know how to do this, and I'm kind of working through this? That's the sort of stuff that like, you know, really does get a better reaction, and like gets them to know you better, which is like ultimately one of the things that we're looking for. There is no sort of like got question right, therefore, you know, it was a good interview. It's that plus what else did we learn about, you know, them, you know, both culturally, both in their problem solving ability. So I think you can do a lot of work with interviewers to keep them engaged. I don't think it's your responsibility by any means whatsoever, but you know, these are the sorts of things that can really do improve both your experience and the sort of results on the other end.
I was going to say, sorry, I just wanted to add on real quick to, I think, Andre's question in the chat about the level of training and people feeling bored. I think that's something like, if you're interviewing and you kind of get that, I think that's valid feedback to give to the recruiting team. Like, a lot of, like, most companies, you go through some basic level of interview training and shadowing and all of that. But a lot of how we improve our process is through constant feedback. And if we're not getting feedback on how things are going, we're only getting like one side of the story. And I think that it, like, as an interviewer, like, yeah, on the one hand, as Jimmy said, like, once you've asked the same question, you know, like 100, 200 times, it can be difficult. But in situations where, you know, you're getting someone and they're just, you know, they're giving you nothing at all, and you're trying and they're still like giving you absolutely nothing, like, that's a signal, and you should probably kind of interpret that and be like, that's maybe not the best, and just raise that with the recruiter, or if you talk with the hiring manager later. Like, I think those are good things to pass along, because like, everyone wants their recruiting process to be empathetic and kind at the same time that we're, you know, asking all of these questions. And so it should be
totally. Actually, the first question I always ask in any wrap up is just like, how do we treat you? How do we engage with you? Because it's not just important from a sort of like, are we putting our best foot forward? But it's actually important from a like, are we actually going to evaluate you and make sure that we're evaluating you fairly and like, against those things. And so that is like a super important thing. Like you should be given as much of us as we possibly can, because it is, you get whatever, one shot in this sort of moment to do a lot of this stuff, and we have to meet you there to make sure you are able to present yourself in the best way possible. We're not trying to trick you. We're really trying to see the best side of you so that we can bring on amazing.
I saw someone in the chat that said I never thought questions asked to interviewers held such value, and I feel like that's what we're talking about here. Like interviewing the interviewer, building a relationship, really trying to really like taking ownership over your part in the interview. And that's a great way to just like show value at the end of the day. Rich, you kicked off this conversation and then it like, so do you want to end us with some tips that you have for connecting with interviewers? And just so you know, we have maybe like 45 seconds, because the last thing that I want to ask before we leave is like, what roles are you all hiring for, if you are hiring? So just give us 30 seconds on how to build rapport with interviewers.
Yeah, I think like as much as is possible in the tough situation that you're in, like the high pressure interview situation, I think it is about like trying to understand what the interviewer is looking for in some sense too, right? Like what is this problem? Like I've even had actually some candidates ask me like, am I going in the right direction, or is there a different way you want me to look at or think about this problem? And I think that's actually a very good way to sometimes like try to understand what we're trying to solve together. And I think that's like a tactical thing, perhaps. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, this was all amazing. Megan, Jimmy, Richard, what are you hiring for right now, if you're hiring at all?
Yeah, basically hiring for SRE and backend engineer roles to help with dev productivity. SRE is a super overloaded term depending on where you are. So if the words SRE, DevOps, Ops, or like dev productivity mean something to you or are of interest and sound interesting, definitely hit me up.
I am, you know what? My group is looking for everything. If you're an engineer, if you're a PM, if you're a designer, we're interested. On the engineering side, I'm looking for, product engineers, people who want to come in, like understand, humans who use our products, who want to help people build software for their teams and for their businesses, and kind of like allow less technical people build software that sort of like enables them. We're looking for engineers to come in, front end, back end, full stack. If you want to come in and touch a wide part of our surface.
Awesome. Thank you, Jimmy.
Roles
Rich,
for folks in
last
this
one,
area.
not least.
Yes, similar to Jimmy, we're looking across the board as well. We on the platform side in general, full stack is also an overloaded term, but we really do have people who like from front end engineering who will design their own mocks and implement it to back end engineers and everything in between. We're definitely for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for the time. It looks like the main stage is starting up. So hopefully folks can connect with you on LinkedIn. We shared our career page for those roles that Jimmy, Rich, and Megan talked about. And if you have any questions, please ping me, DM me on Hopin, and we'll get to talking. Thank you all. Peace.
We're going.
Thanks.